Hey guys, it's Bear. It's Friday, December 4th. This is Life of T-Men, and this week's topic is gender versus sexuality. For the sake of simplicity, I'm actually going to refer to it more as gender versus sexual orientation, because as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, your orientation and your sexuality are slightly different, and what I'd rather focus on is the actual difference between gender and sexual orientation or attraction. So, gender versus orientation, they're two inherently different concepts that tend to get kind of mashed together and blurred, and I'm not sure why, but I can kind of tell why, if that makes sense. So to just sum it up, your gender, again, is how you identify. We talked about that last week. You know, for instance, I was born biologically female, raised female, presented as female for, the majority of my life, but I identify as male, and now I'm taking steps to transition and live as male. So that's your gender. It's your identity. It's, again, how you see the world, how you present to the world, and how the world sees you. Your orientation is completely different. It's who you are attracted to. Whether you want to talk about that as being sexual, romantic, platonic, or physical attraction, they kind of all are separate concepts that get balled into one, as again we talked about in a previous video. And for some reason, they tend to get kind of mashed together in people's brains when you step outside of the kind of heteronormative scope and viewpoint. So for someone who's never questioned their gender identity, and for somebody who's never had to question their sexuality, for like a heterosexual person, it can get a little bit confusing because you're not in the mind of the other person. So it's fair that they get confused, but at the same time, it's kind of obvious to me that they're separate things. So I understand that people don't really quite get it, but what starts to get weird to me is when people feel like it's appropriate to ask you about it, and that actually happens to trans people quite a lot, and it's a little bit weird, because if you just met me, the way I present now, which is as male, or if you met any other guy on the street, you wouldn't automatically say like, oh, well, hi, Bear, it's good to meet you. By the way, are you straight or are you gay? And yet, when people find out that you're trans, or when you come out to them as trans, either before you transition or after, a fair amount of people will actually go ahead and be so bold as to say to you like, oh, well, what's your orientation? Or, what's your, who you attracted to? And it's just a little bit weird to me, because it's like, none of your business. And it's also not inherently linked to my gender or my sex. Your physical parts don't mandate your orientation, and neither does your gender identity. So it's quite frankly a little bit rude when people ask about it. That's when I start to get like, hey, that's my business. And I'm not that way with my, gender identity and my trans status. I'm quite open about it. I'm happy to answer people's questions and talk to people about my process and stuff, to an extent. Like I've said before, I don't really appreciate it when people ask me about surgeries that I've had or surgeries that I plan to have. Again, that's just really personal. But yeah, when they kind of jump to the next question of your orientation, you're just kind of like, that's my private business, and it's something that I'm happy to discuss with close friends, as you would, but why do you feel like it's within your rights to ask me about that just because you now know that I'm trans and I've transitioned? So those are my feelings on it, and that's my explanation of the difference. I will say that I do think that part of the reason they do get confused is because you have, quote unquote, the LGBT spectrum, and it's a much longer acronym now, which includes a lot more stuff like queer, questioning, androgynous, and so forth, and I don't know the right order to say it in, so sorry. But it's one acronym, LGBT, and I don't really agree with that. Like LG and B are sexual orientations, and that's its own spectrum, as we've talked about. And gender and being transgender, the T, it's its own separate spectrum. They're two completely different concepts, so I don't really understand why they're mashed together into that one spectrum. And I think that it causes a lot of confusion within the cis and heterosexual communities, and it also there's a lot of strife between all those groups that I could totally do another video about, and I might actually do that. So I'm gonna go on record as saying that I don't think that they should be combined into being one, lump group. I think that they're separate concepts, and in the end we're all human, so why isn't it just, why does it even have to be there? But again, that's a different video. So that's my interpretation and definition of gender versus orientation. I'm sure that there are people that feel differently about it. I'm sure there are people that feel differently about what I just mentioned, the LGBT spectrum, and where I fall on it and stuff. But yeah, that's my definitions, and that's how I feel about it, and how I feel about talking about it. So thanks for subscribing to this channel, and thanks for listening to the last couple of videos where we've gone through all these concepts. It's been really fun to think about and to kind of put into words, and it's really been interesting to see the other guys' videos and how they feel about it and how they interpret it. So again, thanks for your interest and for subscribing, and we'll see you next week.